This episode is going to be fun because I feel like now, after all of the background we needed to understand the concept of the unconscious, now we get to the fun part. At least it's the fun part to me because the structure of the unconscious gives us a way to sort of organize different ways of looking at our own personality. And now that we understand the history, we come to the functional part now of how all this works. So we begin in the year 1925, the year that Carl Gustav Jung turned 50 years old. He had quite the year of travel because in January 1925, he was in New Mexico at the Taos Pueblo, where he had gone to study the dreams and mythology of the Hopi, and he met their chief called Mountain Lake, or Antonio Mirabal, who he kept a relationship through letters the rest of his life. During the summer of 1925 and all through the fall, Jung traveled to Africa. And the fun part for me is that as Jung went to Africa, traveling to Kenya and Uganda, he hit the jackpot. And I have to explain what I mean by that. He didn't know, and he could not have known, because in East Africa, Jung was at ground zero of haplogroup L3. All these years later, haplogroup L3 turns out to be the mitochondrial DNA of 90% of the people on this planet. 90% originated in the Great Rift Valley, on the plains of the Serengeti, on the shores of Lake Victoria, in Kenya and Tanzania. It's the jackpot because that's where we come from. That's where modern humans, Homo sapiens, originated. The year was somewhere within 5,000 years, between 75,000 to 70,000 BP. That means before the present, rather than using a mythological reference like BC or BCE. Haplogroup L3 originated in a very interesting time frame, and you could say somewhere within those 5,000 years, from 75 to 70,000 BP, the single most important thing that ever happened to human beings happened. So let's look at that. That time period puts us in the genetic bottleneck, as it's called. That we can tell from the genes that around that time there were very, very few Homo sapiens. One theory for the bottleneck has to do with the eruption of the supervolcano Toba in Indonesia around that time, and it caused an abrupt climate change that made it difficult for humans and plants and other species to survive. It's estimated that the bottleneck meant there were as few as 2,000 to 10,000 individual Homo sapiens left on the planet at that time. Another theory is called the long bottleneck, which posits that this happened over a longer period of time. But we know that somewhere between 75 and 70,000 BP, there were very few people left on the planet, which comes to the second thing. During this same time period, the so-called second migration out of Africa occurred. The first migration had been a while ago, about 130,000 years BP, and In the bottleneck, all of those people who had previously left in the first migration somehow were wiped out. And that's why we're descended from the people of the second migration. And it's thought that possibly as few as 1,000 individuals walked to the Arabian Peninsula, to Yemen, from Africa, from which all the rest began. And the third thing that's important has to do with the last evolutionary change to the human brain that we're aware of. Sometimes it's called the Great Leap Forward. Something changed that gave Homo sapiens a capacity they had not had before. I think it has to do with the capacity for abstraction. It's possible that didn't exist before, and maybe abstract representation. When I say representation, I mean the ability to represent something with images and symbols. That would be a great leap forward. And by talking about the Great Leap Forward and the last evolutionary change to the brain, what we really mean is that theoretically, we could swap babies to 75,000 years ago. I could take you as an infant from the arms of your mother and swap you to a new mother 75,000 years ago, and I could take her baby from her arms and bring her here to our time and our family. And both babies would thrive, each in their own cultural environment, because there are no essential differences between that time and this time, theoretically. Now, all of this about haplogroup L3 is really in the service of talking about what human beings are like. What you are like, what I am like, and previously, we've talked about two parts. We've talked about the consciousness and the unconscious, but now we come to the part we have to go a bit further and talk about the structure of the unconscious, and we need some more sophisticated models, of which the first is Freud's topographical model. So the topographical model comes in Freud about the year 1900 with the publication of his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And he starts with a very basic thing, I think, that helps us. So he thinks of consciousness, which I would call ego consciousness. Below that, pre-consciousness, which is essentially those things of which we are capable of being conscious, and yet with the shortcomings of our attention span, we have to only keep in mind so much at one time. But the pre-conscious is all those things of which we could be conscious if we directed our attention to it. And then below that, Freud's initial idea of what he called the unconscious. And early on in 1900, for Freud, the unconscious was the repressed personal memories of things that were once in consciousness and fell out of consciousness. That's very much the idea of a basement, except the idea that the basement door is locked and all the things that don't want to be seen are hidden in the basement. They were once upstairs on the main floor. They've been now repressed, locked in the basement. And that is the content of the unconscious. That's a very, very simple view. Okay, Freud's tripartite model essentially said the unconscious consisted of things which had been previously conscious and now had fallen into the unconscious through the mechanism of repression. So in 1900 for Freud, the first part was the unconscious is the place where things are repressed by the censor to protect consciousness from disturbing thoughts. And so that's where we get the stuff that we talk about, defense mechanisms, the way in which the censor protects consciousness from disturbing thoughts, which would be, as we said, repression, projection, displacement, regression, rationalization, sublimation, reaction formation. We could talk about what all those mean, but it's, again, the idea that this unconscious is a place where things of which we were once conscious have now fallen into the basement. Moving forward now to 1909, when Freud and Jung had their famous trip to America, to Clark University, and they had 2 weeks on the boat together, back and forth. Jung is already starting to say to Freud that he has other ideas about the unconscious as being more than just the repository of repressed personal memory. And in particular, Jung is starting to talk about instinct. And instinct had already been brought in as a subject of psychological research by Wilhelm Wundt, and then that's another story, but briefly, that Wilhelm Wundt is considered one of the founders of psychology, one of the founders of experimental psychology, and in Leipzig, he was beginning to talk about instinct as an underlying operating system of the human species. So Freud is beginning to get this pressure about more to the unconscious than just repressed personal memory. And by 1912, Jung is writing the book that we come to call now Symbols of Transformation. In 1912, it's volume 5 in Jung, Wandlungen der Libido, which was part of the basis of his break with Freud in 2 ways. Jung is talking about libido in that book being more than just sexual libido for Freud. So he's breaking the sexual theory, which Freud considered absolute, and essentially proposing more of a drive theory that libido has many forms. It could be sexual, it could be kinship libido, it could be hunger, all of what eventually became drives. And now in 1912, Jung, for the first time, is beginning to talk about a collective unconscious, in addition to the Freudian repressed memory unconscious, which Jung began to call the personal unconscious. So now we get a 3-part division: consciousness, the personal unconscious of the repressed things from consciousness, which Jung did not dispute, and then thirdly, now an instinctual or the collective unconscious. We have to stop for just a minute and say there's a way in which by now, 100 years later, the term collective unconscious has been a problematic term. It's problematic in the sense that, again, colloquially, people confuse collective consciousness with the collective unconscious as a sort of mystical union of minds. That is not at all what Jung described as the collective unconscious. And then in later years, he proposed other terms, such as the objective psyche, rather than the term collective unconscious. But in the first place, what Jung is beginning to talk about is instinct. In other words, now we're talking about nature versus nurture in a model of the unconscious. Nature versus nurture.